There was a company 400 years ago that makes today's tech giants look like small startups. It was worth an estimated $7.9 trillion. It had its own army, its own currency, and the power to start wars. It wasn't a country, it was a Dutch corporation, the VOC. But how did a small group of merchants from an even smaller country create the world's first superpower? And more importantly, how did they lose it all? To understand this, we have to go back to the late 16th century. For years, the spice trade was locked down. The Portuguese were the only ones allowed to trade spices with the East Indies. This was set in stone by the Treaty of Tordesillas. But when Portugal fell under Spanish rule, the great enemy of the Dutch Republic, the ports were closed to Dutch ships. The Republic was trapped. There was only one risky solution: sail to the East Indies themselves to get the spices. So, in 1595, 4 Dutch ships of the Compagnie van Ver, the Company of Far Lands, led by Cornelis de Houtman, left Texel. They headed for Banten, the biggest trading hub in the Asian region. Their goal was clear: find a trade route to Asia without paying expensive middlemen. The journey was brutal. 2.5 years later, only 3 ships and 87 of the 249 men returned. Financially, it wasn't exactly a success. The profit was barely enough to cover the costs. But they proved one thing: the route worked. Trade was possible without the Portuguese stopping them. The voyages that followed became more successful and profits grew. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the pie. Dozens of small Dutch companies started competing against each other, driving profits down. The Dutch statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt had a bold vision: stop competing with each other and start competing against the world. On March 20, 1602, he forced the rival companies to merge into the VOC. But trade wasn't his only motive. He needed the profits to help fund the war against Spain. The government gave the VOC a monopoly on all Dutch trade in Asian waters. The VOC also got the power to sign treaties, wage wars, and rule colonies. They even had their own army and currency. But global domination isn't cheap, and the company was short on cash. To pay for it, the VOC revolutionized finance. They funded their ships by virtually selling pieces of the fleet to ordinary citizens. This changed everything. Under the old system, you invested in one voyage. Ship returns, profit is split, company closes. You had to start over every time. The problem? You can't build an empire on temporary bets. The VOC wanted forts and warships. That requires something permanent. So they introduced permanent shares. Now, citizens could own a piece of the company and trade it freely. By making these shares tradable, the Dutch didn't just fund a company. They created the beginning of the stock market as we know it today. It was a golden move. With an endless stream of public money, the VOC didn't just plan a voyage, they built an empire. They constructed massive shipyards, a permanent fleet of warships, and a chain of forts. With this power, they developed intra-Asian trade. They took silver from Japan, traded it for textiles in India, and traded the textiles for spices in Indonesia. The ships were always full. Profits kept growing. To run this machine, they needed a ruthless leader. Enter the Governor-General, Jan Pieter Zoon Koen. In 1619, he conquered Jakarta and founded Batavia. Koen was very clear about how the VOC should operate. He famously stated, "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." From Batavia, he ruled with an iron fist. Did a local island want to trade with the English? The VOC stopped them. With diplomacy if possible, with brute force if necessary. But where did all that money go? It didn't just sit in a vault. It flooded back to the Dutch Republic. It transformed a small, swampy country into the center of the world. The profits funded the famous Canal Ring of Amsterdam. It paid for the masterpieces of Rembrandt and Vermeer. Amsterdam became the warehouse of the world. The cellars along these canals were bursting with spices, silk, and porcelain. It was a place where anything could be bought. And if you look closely at the map of Amsterdam today, the echoes of this empire are still there. You can walk down the Bantamerstraat, named after Banten, the very first Indonesian port they reached. Or turn into the Pepperstraat, Pepper Street, named after the black gold that paid for these bricks. Even the grandest canal, the Herengracht, was built for and named after the Heron, the gentleman who ruled this corporate empire. The VOC didn't just make money, it bought the Dutch Golden Age. But behind this golden image, the company was rotting. They refused to innovate. While the British built faster, modern ships, the Dutch stuck to their old design, the flute ship. They also ran out of sailors. Conditions on board were so bad that experienced crews stayed away. So the VOC turned to soul sellers. These recruiters kidnapped drunks and desperate men from the streets of Amsterdam to fill the ships. Financially, the VOC was a house of cards. They paid for voyages with loans based on future profits. When the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out in 1780, ships stopped coming home. The loans couldn't be paid. The trading giant had turned into a joke. Even their name was mocked. People whispered that VOC no longer stood for the United East India Company, but for Vergaan onder corruptie, perished under corruption. In 1799, the money was gone. The richest company of all time went bankrupt. The Dutch state stepped in and nationalized the company. They took over the assets, but they also inherited a crushing debt of 219 million guilders. And as for the land, it was a broken empire. The Dutch state claimed the rights to territories spanning from South Africa and Sri Lanka to the entire Indonesian archipelago. But in the geopolitical chaos that followed, they lost the Cape and Ceylon to the British, leaving them with just the East Indies. This was the start of the colonial era of the Dutch East Indies, which would later become modern Indonesia, and the end of the world's first multinational.